Formula One is supposed to be the pinnacle of motorsport, where brilliant engineering meets stupid fast speeds in a quest for glory. However, for every championship-winning machine, there's another that goes up in a cloud of smoke. Today we are looking at 15 most unreliable cars F1 has ever seen. You can probably guess who's number 1 on this list, but number 5 will definitely catch you off guard, just like it did Mastercard. At the very beginning of our countdown sits the March 721X, a car so fundamentally broken that it nearly ended a future world champion's career before it began. March Engineering had enjoyed a solid 1971 season, with Ronnie Peterson finishing second in the championship, establishing them as a serious force for Formula One. For 1972, they sold a drive to a promising young Austrian named Niki Lauda, who took out a substantial loan to fund his F1 dream. March promised him a revolutionary new car that would keep them at the sharp end of the grid. The March 721X was built around an experimental concept that sounded brilliant in theory. A transverse gearbox mounted ahead of the rear engine to centralize weight. This radical layout was supposed to create a nimble, perfectly balanced racing car that would dance through corners. What they created instead was a mechanical abomination that Niki Lauda later called the worst car I ever drove. This from the man who raced some genuinely awful machinery over his career. According to Lauda's brutal assessment, the 721X had no downforce. It understeered, it oversteered, it was slow down the straight, and the gear change was awful as well. For Lauda, who had gambled his financial future on this drive, the 721X represented a nightmare scenario. The breaking point came at Monaco, where he struggled at the back of the field, contemplating whether to walk away from racing entirely. Yes, the driving experience was that demoralizing. March eventually realized they'd created a monster and hastily abandoned the 721X project mid-season. They cobbled together a new car based on an older Formula 2 design, effectively admitting that their revolutionary concept was so flawed they'd rather race a converted junior Formula car. Colin Chapman's name appears twice in this list, which tells you everything about his approach to Formula One. Brilliant innovation that sometimes crossed the line into just plain stupidity. Team Lotus was riding high in 1973 with the Lotus 72, a car that had dominated the earlier 1970s. For 1974, Chapman aimed to create a lighter, more technologically advanced successor that would maintain their competitive edge. The Lotus 76 was packed with innovations that looked impressive on paper. It featured a sleeker monocoque, inboard side radiators for better aerodynamics, even a pioneering electronic clutch system operated via a button on the gear lever. The car had a unique 4-pedal arrangement for left-foot braking as well. With star drivers Ronnie Peterson and Jackie Ickx behind the wheel, expectations were enormous. Well, the electronic clutch system proved to be a nightmare from the very first race. Peterson's clutch malfunctioned repeatedly at the South African Grand Prix, causing start-line drama throughout the weekend. After reverting to a conventional clutch, the 76's problems multiplied. The new chassis had severe handling imbalances that made it actively dangerous to drive. Peterson complained of brutal oversteer that would snap without warning, while Ickx suffered brake failure that left him fighting the car rather than racing it. The most embarrassing moment came at Monaco, where Peterson won the race in the old Lotus 72. The team had enough of their new car and resurrected the previous year's model, so Peterson had a chance to show what a proper Lotus could do. By season's end, Lotus had shelved the 76 permanently. The car never achieved a single podium finish in a championship race, making it one of the biggest disappointments in F1 history. Sometimes the most shocking failures come from the most successful teams. Ferrari entered 1980 as the reigning champions, having won both titles in 1979 with the 312 T4. The 312 T-Series have been incredibly successful since 1975, netting 4 Constructors' Championships. With Jody Scheckter defending his driver's title and Gilles Villeneuve providing insane speed, Ferrari had every reason to expect another strong season. The 312 T5 was essentially the final evolution of Ferrari's successful formula, a flat 12 engine with transverse gearbox that had worked brilliantly through the late 1970s. However, while Ferrari refined their existing concept, the rest of the grid embraced the ground effects revolution that Lotus had pioneered. Ferrari's conservative approach proved catastrophic. The wide flat 12 engine made it nearly impossible to implement effective side pod tunnels for ground effect, leaving the 312 T5 aerodynamically outdated. They scored just 8 points in total, finishing 10th in the constructors' standings, an almost unthinkable drop for the defending champions. There's unreliable and there's uncompetitive, but then there's the 1985 Alfa Romeo 185T, featuring Alfa's 1.5-litre turbo V8, which on paper produced around 780 horsepower, competitive with the best engines of the era. However, the pursuit of power had come at the cost of everything else. The engine was suffering from turbo lag and had reliability that made a coin flip look predictable. The car wasn't just unreliable though, it was actively unpleasant to drive, with handling that Riccardo Patrese described as unpredictable and dangerous. The team entered 8 races with the new car but scored exactly 0 points. After the British Grand Prix, they reverted to running the year-old 184T with light updates. The 185T's failure was so complete that it effectively ended Alfa Romeo's enthusiasm for Formula One. The company withdrew from the sport entirely after 1985. At number 11, we got the Lotus 80. It was meant to be Colin Chapman's masterpiece, the car that would cement his reputation as Formula One's greatest innovator. The Lotus 80 basically took ground effect to its logical extreme. Chapman extended the 79's successful side pod concept along the entire length of the car, with flexible skirts running from nose to tail. In theory, this would turn the entire chassis into one giant ground effect device, generating massive downforce while maintaining minimal drag. The reality was a car that couldn't decide whether it wanted to fly or stick to the track. The Lotus 80 jumped up and down wildly as the long curved skirts lost and regained contact with the ground. Mario Andretti described driving the 80 as a nightmare. Chapman added conventional wings back onto the car to try to stabilize it, completely defeating the original wingless concept, but that didn't help at all. The Lotus 80 raced only 4 times before Chapman gave up in despair. Andretti managed one remarkable podium finish in Spain through sheer skill in managing the car's unpredictable behavior. Carlos Reutemann, the second driver for Lotus that season, flatly refused to race it, sticking with the older Lotus 79 throughout the season. Opening the top 10, I've got Gordon Murray's experimental phase and the Brabham BT55, which represented his most ambitious gamble yet. After designing championship-winning cars for a while, Murray decided to completely rethink F1 aerodynamics with the low-line concept. Sounds familiar, right? Brabham had been a top team in the early 1980s, winning championships in 81 and 83 with Nelson Piquet. However, by 86, Piquet had departed for Williams, and Murray saw an opportunity to regain supremacy through radical innovation. The BT55's concept was elegant in its simplicity. Lay the BMW straight 4-turbo engine on its side at a sharp angle to create an extremely low profile. Well, the exception was anything but simple. Murray effectively created a Formula One car where the driver would lay nearly horizontal in the cockpit, with an engine cover so low that it looked more like a sports prototype than a Grand Prix car. In theory, this radical packaging would give the BT55 a significant aerodynamic advantage. However, the reality was far different. The laid-over BMW turbo engine immediately suffered from oil issues. When tilted at such extreme angles, oil would pool in the wrong places and refuse to circulate properly. This obviously led to frequent engine failures. But the engine problems were just the beginning. The BT55 proved nearly impossible to set up properly, with handling that drivers described as unpredictable. While the low profile made it stable in high-speed corners, the car struggled everywhere else. Riccardo Patrese and Elio De Angelis were tasked with taming this mechanical beast, but their experience perfectly illustrated the BT55's fundamental flaws. By season's end, the BT55 had scored only a handful of points from a couple of sixth-place finishes. The revolutionary design had proven to be an evolutionary dead end. The early 1990s were a wild time in Formula One, with manufacturers trying all sorts of exotic engine configurations. Most were terrible ideas, but few were as comprehensively awful as Subaru's Flat 12 experiment with Coloni. Coloni was already struggling as a tiny team when Subaru bought a majority stake and decided to showcase their Flat 12 3.5-litre engine. The idea was that a Flat 12 could provide competitive power while keeping the center of gravity low. But it doesn't really matter how low your center of gravity is if you ain't got any power, does it? The Subaru 1235 engine was built by Motori Moderni and produced about 559 horsepower, well short of the 600 plus that top teams were getting. Worse, the engine was heavy at 159 kilograms, and when you installed in the modified C3B chassis, it added a whopping 112 kilograms, or 246 pounds for you bold eagle peoples, to the car's overall weight. Driver Bertrand Gachot described the experience as wrestling with an unpredictable beast. In the first 8 races of 1990, Gachot failed to pre-qualify every single time, usually finishing dead last in Friday sessions. He was typically 10+ seconds off the pace, sometimes several seconds behind even the next slowest car. The situation became so embarrassing that by mid-season, Subaru and team owner Enzo Coloni had a spectacular falling out. Subaru pulled their support and fled F1 entirely, leaving Coloni to hastily retrofit the old Cosworth V8 back into the chassis. Suddenly, the team could pre-qualify. If you thought we'd covered some disasters already, buckle up because at number 8 I've got Life L190, and that car exists in a category all its own. Life Racing Engines was a tiny Italian outfit founded by Ernesto Vita with one goal: to showcase their revolutionary W12 engine. The Life L190 was essentially a vehicle for this mechanical experiment. The chassis itself was actually recycled from an abandoned project, because Life basically took the unused first team's F1 design, stuck their W12 in it, and hoped for a miracle. Well, while rival engines in 1990 were producing 600 to 700 horsepower, Life's W12 barely managed an estimated 375, roughly half the power of competitive cars. On track, this translated to performance so poor it was borderline surreal. The L190 was around 64 km/h slower through speed traps than any other car. That's a 40 miles per hour different for you Walmart boys out there. However, being slow was just the beginning of the L91's problems. The W12 engine would overheat or break down after just a few laps, leaving mechanics scrambling to keep it running. To be honest, the car rarely managed more than 6 to 8 laps at a time before something catastrophic happened. Gary Brabham, son of 3-time world champion Jack Brabham, started the season as Life's driver. After failing to pre-qualify at 2 races where he couldn't even complete a flying lap at racing speeds, Brabham quit the team in despair. That's right, he just gave up on this pile of garbage and walked away. Bruno Giacomelli replaced Brabham and bravely tried to make something of the impossible situation. However, the numbers tell the real story. Life entered 14 Grand Prix weekends in 1990, but never once made it onto the race grid. Not once. The Andrea Moda S921 was criminally negligent. This wasn't just a bad car, it was a dangerous one, run by a team so dysfunctional that the FIA eventually expelled them from the championship. Andrea Moda Formula emerged from the ashes of Coloni in 1992, brought by Andrea Sassetti, a businessman whose understanding of Formula One seemed limited to the fact that it existed. The S921 was based on a shelved Simtech design originally intended for BMW, updated on the cheap and built with minimal resources. Sounds like a solid plan already, right? The S921's problems began before it even hit the track. At its first race in South Africa, the team was turned away because they failed to pay the mandatory $100,000 entry deposit, a rookie mistake. At the Belgian Grand Prix, Perry McCarthy's car was sent out with a known broken steering component because the team didn't want to spend money on replacement parts. Still, somehow against all odds, the S921 managed one moment of glory. At the 1992 Monaco Grand Prix, Roberto Moreno squeezed the car into 26th on the grid, dead last, but it technically qualified for the race. To be fair, the team celebrated like they'd won the championship. In the race, Moreno ran at the back as expected and actually climbed to 19th before the inevitable happened. The engine failed on lap 11. The farce reached its climax when team boss Sassetti was arrested for fraud. The FIA, having seen enough of Andrea Moda's amateur hour operation, promptly expelled the team from the championship, putting an end to this madness. Pacific Grand Prix stepped up from Formula 3000 in 1994 with big dreams and a small budget, a combination that rarely ends well in Formula 1. The PR01 was originally designed for a 1993 debut that never happened due to financial problems, which meant by the time it hit the track, it was already a year behind the competition. Designed by Paul Brown and powered by customer Ilmor V10, the car looked the part but was seriously underdeveloped. With minimal wind tunnel time and almost no on-track testing, Pacific was essentially using Friday practice sessions as their R&D department. The results were predictably disastrous. The PR01 lacked downforce, especially on high-speed circuits like Spa and Monza, where it was embarrassingly slow. Even worse than being slow was being fragile. The car suffered from cooling issues, weak gearbox components, and a habit of breaking whatever part you needed most at any given moment. Pacific attempted 32 starts in 1994, but recorded exactly 0 classified finishes. Let me repeat that: 0. By late season, Pacific was so cash-strapped they literally couldn't develop the car anymore. They hired pay drivers for 1995 and eventually built a new car. However, the PR01 had already cemented their reputation as a team that couldn't finish a race. At number 5, I've got my favourite story of them all. The Mastercard Lola T97 30 holds a unique place in F1 history as the car with the shortest competitive lifespan. Most failed F1 cars at least manage to race for a season before everyone realises they're terrible. The Lola T97 30 was so spectacularly awful that it lasted exactly one race weekend before the team folded and went home. The Mastercard-backed team was originally planned for a 1998 debut, but sponsor pressure forced them into 1997 with a car that was fundamentally unready for competition. The car was powered by a Ford Zetec RV8, already a disadvantage when top teams were running V10s. Even worse, the chassis was designed under extreme time pressure without proper wind tunnelling development or testing. When the T97 30 finally hit the track at the 1997 Australian Grand Prix, the extent of its inadequacy became painfully obvious. Drivers Vincenzo Sospiri and Riccardo Rosset reported that the car struggled with basic things like getting its tyres up to operating temperature. The qualifying session at Melbourne was a humiliation of historic proportions. Sospiri was 11.6 seconds slower than pole position, while Rosset managed to be even worse at 12.7 seconds off the pace. Neither car came close to the 107% qualifying rule. After this catastrophic debut, the financial backers pulled out immediately. The team packed up their cars and shipped them back to the UK before the next race in Brazil, never to return. The Stewart SF01 really shouldn't be on this list. It wasn't your typical unreliable backmarker. This thing was genuinely quick. when three-time world champion Jackie Stewart launched his own team in 1997, and he didn't mess around. However, the SF01's Achilles heel was its appalling reliability. That's literally how it was described. The main thing was the connection between the Ford V10 engine and the oil system, which had been designed by someone who apparently thought oil was optional. The result was constant oil pressure problems that would leave drivers watching their engines seize up or explode in clouds of smoke. Out of a possible 34 starts across the season, Stewart managed just 8 classified finishes. By season's end, despite having one of the fastest new cars on the grid, Stewart GP had scored just 6 points and finished 9th in the Constructors' Championship. It would later become Jaguar F1 team run by Ford and end up being bought by Red Bull for $1. By the way, I made an entire video about the origins of current F1 teams. You should check it out. And if you've made it this far, consider subscribing to the channel, as I'm trying to break through 35,000 subscribers by the end of September. Subscribe! The McLaren MP4-20 occupies a unique position in this countdown because it was actually the fastest car of 2005. This wasn't a slow backmarker or an uncompetitive disaster. It was a potential championship winner that threw away both titles through sheer unreliability. McLaren entered 2005 with renewed optimism. Adrian Newey had designed a clean sheet car to cope with new aerodynamic regulations, and Mercedes had produced what was reportedly the most powerful engine of the year. Raikkonen and Montoya both provided world-class driving talent. It was basically a recipe for a win. The MP4-20 was undeniably quick. When it worked, it was often untouchable, setting pole positions and fastest laps with ease. Raikkonen and Montoya won 10 races between them, more than any other team that season. But McLaren's pursuit of ultimate performance came at a devastating cost. The Mercedes V10, while immensely powerful, struggled to meet 2005's new engine longevity requirements. Engines had to last 2 race weekends, but the MP4-20's power plant was so highly stressed that failures became routine. Engine failures in practice forced him to start from the back of the grid in France, though he showed the car's true pace by recovering to podium position. The most dramatic failure came at the Nürburgring race. After he got a flat spot on the tyres due to a lockup, Raikkonen didn't really have an option to pit, and continuing to circulate on flat-spotted rubber. The constant vibration from the damaged tyre eventually shattered his front suspension on the final lap while he was leading, throwing him out of the race in the cruelest possible fashion. Juan Pablo Montoya's experiences were equally frustrating. In Hungary, his drive shaft failed while he was leading comfortably, handing victory to Jenson Button's less powerful BAR. By season's end, the statistics told a heartbreaking story. McLaren had won more races than anyone else, but lost both championships. The driver's title by 21 points and the constructors by just 9. Those margins represented exactly the points lost through mechanical failures. Top 3 is a great tale about those tobacco dollars and Formula One teams. Probably my favourite of them all, British-American Racing, arrived in Formula One with more swagger than substance, making bold predictions about winning races in their first year. What they delivered instead was the BAR01, a car that perfectly embodied the phrase, "all show, no go." Despite a massive budget and world champion Jacques Villeneuve behind the wheel, BAR managed to score exactly 0 points in their debut season. Built by Reynard, the BAR01 was technically sophisticated and, crucially, not fundamentally slow. The car featured a Supertech V10 engine, and the team had a partnership with Bridgestone tyres, creating a package that often qualified in the midfield when everything worked properly. The problem was, everything rarely worked properly. Jacques Villeneuve's season began with one of the most remarkable streaks in F1 history. He started the year with 11 consecutive retirements, failing to finish every single race from Australia through Hungary. That's 3/4 of the season. The pattern was always the same. Villeneuve would qualify respectably, often in points-paying positions. Then something would break before he could capitalise. By season's end, BAR had become only the second new team in F1 history to contest a full season without scoring a single point. At the top of the list, I've got probably the one car you've been waiting for. The 2015 season marked the highly anticipated reunion of McLaren and Honda, a partnership that had dominated the late 1980s with Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost. Expectations were sky high for a return to championship contention, with Alonso and Jenson Button providing world-class talent behind the wheel. Instead, the MP4-30 delivered one of modern F1's most humbling experiences. McLaren had designed an advanced chassis around their size zero concept, extremely tight packaging aimed at maximising aerodynamic efficiency around Honda's compact new V6 turbo hybrid power unit. Peter Prodromou, poached from Red Bull's aerodynamics department, crafted sleek lines that looked fast even standing still. On paper, the MP4-30 should have been a frontrunner. The reality was a mechanical nightmare. Honda's RA615H power unit was both underpowered and catastrophically unreliable from day one. Honda was effectively a year behind their rivals, who had started developing turbo hybrids in 2014. Pre-season testing revealed the scope of the disaster. The MP4-30 failed to complete a Grand Prix distance in any test session due to constant engine-related problems. The car was often 20 to 30 km per hour slower. That's 18 miles per hour for our American viewers, which makes a huge difference on straights. McLaren's tight size zero bodywork, designed to maximize the Honda engine's compact dimensions, had to be opened up to prevent overheating, negating the entire aerodynamic concept. The team finished 9th in the constructors' standings, ahead only of the hopeless Manor backmarkers. And by the way, exactly after that terrible result, Zak Brown was appointed as executive director and began the rebuild. With the team firmly at the top, I think he's very much succeeded. Honestly, I do hope they are cooking something in the factory to keep this dominance going. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe.